Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone, different parts of the world. It's great pleasure to receive today Marc Morgan. Marc is a senior research fellow at the World Inequality Lab in the Paris School of Economics and the Western Europe coordinator of the World Inequality database. He obtained his PhD from the Paris School of Economics, supervised by Professor Gethin. The thesis was about assets and income distribution, methodological, historical, and institutional perspectives with applications to the case of Brazil. He has been making several contributions, both quantitative and qualitative analysis to the understanding of inequality, with several papers and book chapters published. His research interests include political economy, economic history, macroeconomics, development, and public economics. He is mainly working on the measurement, history, and institutional aspects of income and wealth distributions. So his talk today, his lecture will be on inequality, democracy, and politics, the case of Brazil. And I think that will be very inspiring for many other realities as well. So on behalf of the organizing committee of the second Unicamp International School on Development Challenge, Marc, I'd like to thank you so much for your time. We know that's a period of break in Europe, like in August. So for your time to be here virtually and hopefully in person soon. Okay, so thank you very much and welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Roberto. And good morning, everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be. Let me just share my screen and then we'll get started. Great. So thank you very much, I must say, to the organizers for the invitation to present to this international summer school. As Roberto mentioned, I work at the Paris School of Economics, specifically in the World Inequality Lab, where I am the lead coordinator for research on Western Europe, but I'm also on the Latin America research team for distributional measurement and analysis. So I've been working a lot over the past few years on Latin American countries, but specifically and especially on Brazil. So what I thought would be interesting to present to you in this summer school was a series of research papers that I've written around the themes of inequality, democracy, and politics on Brazil. And I hope this will be interesting for you, and I really wish that we can have a nice dialogue. Please, during the course of this presentation, which should last approximately 40-45 minutes, I would imagine, please ask questions if you have any doubts or questions during the lecture. We'll have time, I imagine, afterwards to have more of a discussion, but please, throughout the presentation, ask questions or comments so that can feed the dialogue. Okay? So without further ado, so what I want to talk about is democracy, inequality, and politics. What do we know about Brazil and inequality in Brazil today? Well, we know that it's in a region that has amongst the highest levels of income inequality in the world. And Brazil is one of the countries with very high levels of inequality. If we look at the share that the richest 10% in the country has in an international perspective, here presenting the map of that we have of the World Inequality Database, and we can see that the richest 10% in Brazil captures over half of national income, roughly at present. Well, this is data just before COVID, so for 2018, 2019. So it's a highly unequal country today, but we also know that it's been a highly unequal country in the past. And what has been labeled throughout Brazilian history as the questão social, so the social question, which essentially means pursuing inclusive growth and development over time. This has been a concept that has been long debated in the country. a country which was the last in the Americas and the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888, already an institution that by definition segregates the population and creates a level of racial and political inequality almost without precedent. So it abolished slavery. It was the last country to do so before its Republican transition, so between 1889 and 1891, in a period where there was really large political inequalities, and we'll get into this later on in the talk. So a country that has a really sharp political inequality legacy in who was allowed to vote, under what conditions, and the issues of inequality, development, industrialization, poverty and inequality were key to Brazilian political debates throughout the last 2 centuries. So from the end of the old republic in 1930, Getúlio Vargas and his regime from 1930 to 1945 really starts off the period of the politicization of inequality to what we can label a politicization of inequality to a large extent. Inequality was central to this period between 1945 and mid-1960s, before the military dictatorship, as we'll see interesting dynamics happening at different dimensions of inequality that we can analyze. And then comes the new republic in the 1980s and 1990s, 2000, the pro-poor governments that come in with the election of the PT in 2002 onwards. Also very interesting history and how politics and inequality were linked. But beyond the politics, there was also very interesting scholarly controversies around the causes of inequality. Was inequality to blame for economic crises in Brazil, the big economic slump in the early 1960s, which was one of the factors that gave way to the military coup? Was the increase in inequality, the big inequality debate between the 60s and 70s between members of the military government and external economists from the World Bank and other institutions? Was inequality, was the increase in inequality, first of all, was there an increase in inequality from the data that was available? And was it caused by pure market forces or institutions? And these were debates that we won't get into, but we can maybe talk about them afterwards, after the lecture, because there's a lot of interesting material in these records. Right up until the early 21st century, when we get another debate as to how real was the decline in inequality in Brazil in the 2000s, how sustained was it? Depending on the data sources you look at, etc. So the persistence of the social question, the pursuit of inclusive growth over time in Brazil was central to the country's evolution. And it must be said that the pursuit and the persistence of the social question is really because it's actually a very hard thing to do, to pursue inclusive growth. It takes time, and with all debates and different points of view, different political alliances, different power alliances, means that it can take a long time and you can get rupture points and setbacks. And so here in Brazil, the rise and fall of presenting graphs on growth in Brazil, inflation, and structural changes in the economy. So since the early 20th century, Brazil has gone through a remarkable amount of change, economically and socially. You can see on the graph to the left, which pictures the national income per adult in Brazil, real national income per adult, how that developed in an extraordinary fashion from the early 20th century, picking up after the Second World War into the 60s, economic miracle into the 70s. You've got the lost decade in the 80s and the early 90s, when inflation and hyperinflation were rampant in the country. And then you get the growth pickup again in the 2000s with the commodity boom and the return of public investment before the recession in 2014 that collapsed the economy and the politics that came before it. So along the same time, I mean, the growth that the Brazilian economy went on through, you can see that's mirrored by large structural changes in the economy. And these structural changes have social and socio-political changes behind them. It's important to keep that in mind. We see that, until the mid-1960s, until the 70s, it was really the period of industrialization in Brazil, manufacturing share of GDP was growing, industry share of GDP was growing as the agricultural share was falling, and the service share was approximately stable until you get to the mid 1980s, and then you get the big change, the big shift, what is sometimes called in Brazil and other similar countries premature deindustrialization, the collapse of the manufacturing and industry shares in GDP. Agriculture keeps falling, but then begins to stabilize a bit in the 2000s. But really, the reversal of industrialization is mirrored by the rise in services, public administration, other self-employed services, etc. So the country over the last century has gone through remarkable changes, not always linear, of course, and this is the interesting part of the story. There's been setbacks, there's been changes, regime changes, political changes, economic changes. And so this all has a politics behind it, and it's very interesting to analyze also the economics and the implications for inequality. But the central point here is that the pursuit of inclusive growth is not easy. And so the questions that I want to talk about or present and try to answer in this lecture is how Brazilian inequality interacted with Brazilian political history in general, and more specifically, what do periods of democratization and redemocratization tell us about the distribution of voting across the population, and what are the implications for the salience of different forms of inequality. So what type of inequality really matters when it comes to understanding, who votes for whom and why. Okay, and I will draw principally from these two papers, which I think were shared with all of you beforehand. So papers on assessing who votes for whom since 1988, new constitution, new data that has come out, the socio-economic factors behind determining the vote for different political parties in Brazil, and also a paper on the democratization, the links between democratization, the welfare state, and redistribution, basically. Okay. So this is the roadmap for the rest of the lecture. Briefly going to introduce the data that exists to study these questions, and then some literature on democratization and redistribution, and then turn to Brazilian democratization in the long run of history before zoning in on the post-1988 period, the period known as the New Republic, where we have more access to microdata, very interesting microdata that allows us to really see what's going on at the individual level in terms of voting dynamics. Okay, so the data, there's no questions so far. In terms of data sources for voter turnout and political suffrage, there's a host of data that can be assembled from census data from the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, to individual research papers that have gathered further archival data, like Love in 1970, a very interesting article on political participation in Brazil. Also international databases, often collated by universities or other researchers, such as the International Idea Voter Turnout Database and the Political Database of the Americas, which assembles all constitutional rules regarding voting and who can vote in elections, what are the restrictions, etc. over time. In terms of electoral surveys, in Brazil at least, and in many other countries, there's access to electoral surveys, microdata electoral surveys. In the case of Brazil, they're collected by the Datafolha Institute, and they are available from the Centro de Estudos de Opinião Pública. And these microdata, basically, they're polls taken just before the second round of all presidential elections in Brazil since 1989. And they have an average sample size of around 10,000 individuals. And they include many socioeconomic variables at the individual level, apart from asking who they voted for or who they're planning to vote for, because it's just 2 weeks before the presidential elections, and a host of their socioeconomic background variables. In terms of income inequality, there are many sources that can be consulted and a growing number of sources over time. First of all, the electoral surveys themselves ask questions about income. We know that when it comes to surveys, the standard household survey in Brazil is the PNAD survey organized by the IBGE. But over, I would say, the last 10 years, there's been an increased use of income tax declarations in Brazil that I've used, that other scholars like Pedro Sousa, Marcelo Medeiros in Brazil have used to see what's happening at the top of the distribution. You know, the income rich that are in the income tax declarations are not necessarily well covered in the household surveys. And then there has been an even more recent literature on distribution on national accounts associated to the work we've been doing at the World Inequality Database in reconciling different sources, putting household surveys together with tax data and national accounts to try and estimate what share of total national income is distributed across different parts of the population. And there's different papers that I've written or currently projects that I'm participating in on Latin American income inequality following this methodology. Okay, so I'm going to draw on a lot of these sources in this presentation. But first, before going into actual data and number crunching, just a word on the literature. What has been said about the relationship between democratization and redistribution? So what a dominant approach in the literature when approaching these concepts is what is known as the redistributive approach. That is, the reason why countries have extended the franchise, have expanded democracy over time, is essentially to ease popular unrest and prevent revolutions. So you increase democracy, you extend the franchise, move to universal suffrage because of the popular pressure that can spill over and lead to violent transitions or revolutions. So political elites make this concession. And there's an assumption that afterwards economic inequality will fall, given that you're increasing the suffrage to less well-off individuals. And there's a host of papers that I've drawn on this line of argument, from Amable and Robinson to Ait and Frank more recently. And linked to this literature is a literature on democratization and the welfare state, the growth of the welfare state, which is made famous by Peter Lindert's work, most notably, where the rise of social spending, Lindert argues, follows the growth of democracy more closely rather than the growth of development per se. So the rise of social spending is not as closely linked to the rise of GDP growth, but it's more closely linked to the growth and the expansion of the franchise. But Linder makes an important qualification that although more people get introduced into the suffrage, into the franchise over time, political mobilization can itself take time, and it's not an automatic transition. Once you make the change to full democracy, to full universal suffrage, you get instantly redistributive reforms. Now, it doesn't happen as quick as that. Political mobilization, it takes time for people, the disenfranchised, to get integrated effectively into the political process. And this, this is links to the interesting difference between the economic literature and more the institutionalist literature in political science. Where if we focus on why should democracy lead to the redistribution, well, the economic literature would say, well, this expansion of the franchise gives the votes to lower income people, which were previously excluded. And these people should have preferences for pro-poor policies, naturally. So you get this linear argument that more labor mobilization leads to more democracy because of the fear of revolution, and greater democracy because it integrates lower income people who have preferences for pro-poor policies. This should lead to more redistributive reforms. However, the institutionalist literature in political science makes important qualifications that preconditions for effective reform. First of all, effective reform is not automatic, and there are certain preconditions that are important. That is essentially looking at the literature to come out, which is, one, you need to have intellectuals and reformist ideologues promoting ideas about change and reforms and specific policy reforms. And you must also have a competent and willing and cooperative bureaucracy that is united in pursuing these reforms. And as we'll see from Brazilian history, this second point has often been what has let, I would say, the country down and continuing to pursue its democratic path. Okay, so move on to the Brazilian democratization in the long run of history. Brazil, since independence, has gone through notable series of constitutional changes and political changes. And here I give a summary of the evolution of suffrage in Brazil since independence from Portugal in the 1820s, right up until the present day, and seeing how the country has carried a legacy of extreme electoral inequality even until very recently, until the present constitution that was passed in 1988. So you can see how, first of all, the minimum voting age in Brazil has gone down from 1925 in the first constitution down to 18 as the obligatory mandatory voting age. But of course, in 1988, since 1988, the vote is optional for persons aged 16 and 17. But you can see has been a downward shift over time, specifically in the transitions from the 19th to the 20th centuries, where the voting age has gone down to cover more of the population. In terms of gender, the Brazilian electoral system excluded women until 1934. So you had at least 2 constitutional periods where women were excluded. And the Imperial Period before the Republican Constitution of 1891 required the income of people to be above a certain amount for them to be able to vote. So there's an income requirement already for most of the 19th century, which was defined at 200 mil reais of the time. But this was abolished in the Republican Constitution in 1891. And since 1891, there's been no income requirement for voting in Brazil. So the censitory, what's often called censorship system, was abandoned. But what has persisted most, the condition that's persisted most over time has been the literacy requirement in Brazil, which persisted right up until the 1988 Constitution. So in all constitutions up until 1988, in all elections, only the literate adults could vote. And this was probably the defining condition in elections in Brazil since the very beginning. You see that secrecy also was abandoned in Brazil after 1934, the Constitution of 1934, and elections became compulsory pretty much in all periods since the 30s, with notable setbacks as to whether voters could actually directly elect candidates. So the last column that talks about direct elections is basically whether voters can directly elect their representatives, as opposed to electing someone who then elects a representative. So more indirect elections. So you can see for example, in the constitutional period 1967 to 1988, there was no direct elections because of the military coup. There's no direct elections for the president of the republic. There was no direct elections for state governors. So all the political executive during the dictatorship was not directly electable. Only municipal prefects and congressmen of the parliament were elected directly. Similar for 1937 to 1945, the Estado Novo of Vargas also abolished all elections for the political executive. So you can see that, the electoral inequality defined as who can vote and who cannot vote, because inequality, we can talk about many forms of inequality, income, wealth, but political inequality, who is in and who's out of the system, is already a notable form of inequality that conditions a lot of other types of inequality. And the condition that has persisted for longest has been the literacy requirement. Those who can read versus those who cannot read or write. And here you can see that it's, by definition, it's tightly correlated to the share of the voting age population that actually votes. So this is showing from 1872 to 2018. It's actually the voters for congressional elections in green, the voters for the presidential elections in blue, and the literacy rate. So the literacy rate went from about 25% in the 1870s, steadily increasing and making its strongest growth in the mid-20th century. But you can see that the share of the voting age population, that is the share of the eligible eligibly aged population, so 25 in the 19th century, 18-year-olds and above in the 20th century, the share of this total population that was voting was extremely low. In Brazil in the 19th century, it's less than 5% for both presidential and congressional elections. And if you look at presidential elections, it's flat up until the 1930s. And then after the 1930s, you get the strong increase in the share of voters voting in elections. And you can see the gap between 1960 and 1986 is the military dictatorship, where voters can no longer vote for the president. But you see a tight correlation between the advancements in literacy and the advancements in voters, which then stabilizes in the new republic at about 80% of the voting age population, as literacy has now reached over 90%. But it's interesting to note in the early period, I mean, in the 1890s, you get such a small population of the registered or of the age eligible population voting, such a small share, because obviously literacy is so low. You only have 25% of the voting age population literate. You've got the legacy of slavery. So if, for example, according to the 1819 census, so illiterates made up about 74% of the population, aged 15 and above. I mean, you have to exclude all literate women as well, because women were excluded from the vote before 1934. If you assume that all the illiterates, the share of illiterates is the same in the population aged 25 and above, and you assume all slaves are illiterate, which is a fair assumption, you get about the 86% of the voting age population were excluded from the vote in the late 19th century. So this is a huge amount that were excluded. And obviously these voting data tells you exactly the amount of people that are actually voting, not those that are registered, but those who are actually voting in the elections. Okay, so this is the evolution of literacy and voting in Brazil over the very long run. During the period of the Old Republic, which is 1891 to 1930, it's been said that democracy was expanding, but it was still extremely limited in practice. And it was extremely limited in practice largely because of two reasons. The parties that were contesting the elections and the parties that were winning the elections, and the margin by which they were winning the elections. So here you can see all presidential election results in Brazil since 1894 to 1960. And during the period of the Old Republic up until 1930, Brazilian presidential elections were largely a contest among the different factions of what was known as the Republican Party at the time. And the Republican Party had several state factions, either the Federal Republican Party from Rio or the Paulista Republican Party from Sao Paulo. So it was generally this alteration between the Republican Party from Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo that were contesting, that were winning the elections. And before largely winning the elections by margins, you can see in the right column, the votes, percentage of total vote for the winner was often above 90% in elections that generally only had one round. There was no two-round elections at the time. So, I mean, this is the period that was often known as the Café con Leite Republic, because of the alteration in power between not only Rio and Sao Paulo, but Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais as well. The Minas Gerais Republican Party was quite strong. I won 4 elections in the early 20th century. And so in this time period until 1930, democracy was limited. You can see that before 1930, from the previous graph, the share of voters was still extremely low, less than 20%, often less than 10% of the voting age population. But then, after the 1930s, after Vargas comes to power and all the subsequent developments, voting and literacy and this developmental state idea really gains traction. So the question is, what do these suffrage extensions, the introduction of women in 1934, etc., have on redistribution? What impact do they have on redistribution, as seen, for example, from welfare state policies? Well, Over time, you can see the long expansion of taxes. If we understood redistributive policies to encompass progressive taxes and social spending as the two principal and core items, then you do see a large expansion, especially from the 1930s, of taxation and social spending on the right, and taxes as a share of GDP on the left. You can see the composition of taxes, direct taxes and indirect taxes. You can see that most of it is still indirect taxes on goods and services that were growing, and especially grew during the military dictatorship. But there was a steady increase in income taxes and social security contributions over time as well. And if you look at social spending, again, since the 1930s, and especially since 1945, social insurance and assistance grew very rapidly as a share of GDP, whereas other types of spending were more stable or only grew much later with constitutional changes in the 80s and the new constitution in 1988, specifically for health spending, as you can see here, whereas education grew a bit more smoothly. But so, at least on first glance, you do see some sort of a correlation between suffrage expansion and a redistributive welfare state. But then you'll tell me, no, but hold on. We thought there was a military coup in 1964 in Brazil that curtailed democratic rights and suspended democracy. But you see that taxes and social spending keeps growing. There's no retrenchment in either taxes or social spending after the mid-1960s. Between mid-1960s and mid-1980s, there's a continuous growth, and even the slope is higher, gets steeper. So there's more social spending and seems to be more taxes, more social contributions during the military dictatorship than before, and progressing at a faster rate. So at least the argument from the economic literature that there's a simple there's a simple linear relationship between mobilization, democracy, and reforms, redistributive reforms, is not that clear cut. And in the papers, we go into depth explaining why this was the case in Brazil. But just to have the second part, or to extend the question, the effects of suffrage not only on welfare redistribution, but on inequality itself. And over the long run, the indicators of inequality that are best available are graphed here, which are the factor shares in national income, labor share and capital share in national income, as well as the top 1% share in national income. And you can see, again, very cyclical evolution, cyclical in terms of the political cycle, as well as the economic cycle, but especially the political cycle. Because as you can see from 1945, from 1942, when Vargas changes his political strategy to attract more mobilization from the working classes, anticipating the end of the war, and to remain in power, and for the parties that he would establish later on, you see this correlation between the top 1% share and the capital share. So a decline over a 20-year period, a strong decline in the share of income going to the top 1%. At the same time, you see a decline in the gross capital share as the labor income share increases. But then from the mid-1960s, after the coup, you get a change in the reform packages and in the political strategy of the country. Capital sharing starts to increase. The top 1% share picks up, stops falling, and the labor income share falls and declines strongly. And so you get these correlations up until this period, until the 1980s. And if you go beyond the 1980s, you see quite interesting dynamics between booming top 1% share and an increasing in capital income, at least capital income share until the mid 2000s. So there does seem to be a correlation between, on the one hand, democratic expansion, welfare reforms, and a decrease in inequality that happened specifically, it seems, between about 1945 and 1964 in Brazil. So there's something interesting and special, it seems, about this period that, contrasting with other periods, either before or after, was not as strong. And so the question, why did Brazil not sustain its mid-20th century leveling? So the leveling that was just shown in the previous graph. Well, the short answer is there was an absence of sustained mass democratic mobilizations because, well, cut short by the 1964 coup. And then the question you can ask is, well, why the civil military coup? Why did that happen? And here there's a dense history, and it's a complex history, but the short answer is essentially changes induced by democratization and industrialization during the time. So important factors to mention are highlighted here. Increased government intervention in the economy in a context of import substitution, industrialization, and all the planning that went with it. Ideological shifts of government towards what was labeled a corporatist populism under Vargas and under the political parties that Vargas founded after the war, the Brazilian Social Democratic Party and the Brazilian Labour Party. The institutional changes were happening alongside the economic changes, so increased unionization, especially among urban workers in industry, mass mobilization associated strongly to the Brazilian Labour Party, which was the fastest growing political party in Brazil at the time. Institutional changes which culminated in the creation of the General Command of Workers in Brazil to integrate, to horizontally integrate the syndicalist movement in Brazil by the early 1960s, which was very strong, and had a active member in government in the Brazilian Labour Party. Very important also in this time period are the political cleavages that emerged from the electoral system, the rules of the electoral system, how it pitted urban against rural voters and literate against illiterate. We saw the divisions that were legislated between literates and illiterates. Illiterates were excluded from the vote in this time period. But it's interesting to note the rules that divided urban and rural populations and the presidency with the parliament. So presidential elections at the time in Brazil were majoritarian elections. They were majoritarian elections that were much more dependent on urban voters because literacy was greater in urban areas. Whereas in parliament, the parliamentary elections, the congressional elections were the share of seats was as a proportion of the share of the overall population. And still at the time, in this time period, between 45 and 64, still most of the population lived in rural areas. So rural votes carried a much higher weight in Congress than urban votes. So you get this division and conflict between, on the one hand, a more populist and urban orientated executive, so presidency, and a more patriarchal and conservative and fractured Congress between the different parties. And you get a presidency that is trying to be ambitious with reforms and proactive. So the Reformas de Base of the Goulart government, the short 2-year government that he had before the coup, which included land reform, profit remittance of international corporations, and importantly included the reform towards universal suffrage, added the economic difficulties, the recession in the early 1960s because of the decline in investment and the failure to renew public investments that were growing in the 1950s, and growing inflation meant that all this cocktail of factors combined together to produce the reaction, which was the civil military coup. There's a long literature on this, but this is just a quick summary of the important factors. And you can see that to appreciate not only at this period in time in the 40s and 50s and 60s, the distribution of power as represented by the distribution of congressional seats in this period, but also if you were going to look at in the 2000s, in the 90s and the 2000s, you get a similar problem, as it were, which is that you've got a fractured parliament between different parties with different leniencies that requires programmatic alliances. And in this time period, you can see that the Brazilian Labour Party is the fastest growing party, went from 7% or 8% of the vote to over 25% 20 years later. And it was allied at the time with the Social Democratic Party, which is also a party that Vargas found after the Second World War. And in general, these two parties alternated the presidency, and they were a growing dominant force in the parliament. You can see that overall the number of parties went from 9 in 1948 to 13 in 1962. But the distribution of power as represented by seats in this period is crucial, because if you think about how the translation of democratic reform to social economic reform happens, it depends on the distribution of power and the distribution of seats, because it's in the end deputies that pass legislation and need to approve legislation that the presidents may initiate. So in this time period, you've got growing political participation. We see that from the graph a few slides ago. You've got increased worker mobilization through the unions. And you've got a Brazilian presidency that's dominated by two pro-Vargas corporatist parties that also increase their dominance in Congress. And so in the end, in this period, if we want to understand, well, the relationship between democratization, redistributive reforms, and inequality, the context is important. And here we can speak about, I think, two factors that I pointed towards in the literature. That indeed in Brazil in this period, you had relatively organized social and political movements with reformist thinking. So even amongst close circles of the presidency, certain members of the civil service, or scholars and intellectuals, there was a lot of reformist thinking around the planning agenda of governments, and relatively organized social and political movements associated to the unions and the Brazilian Labour Party. However, and this is so one precondition was met, but the other precondition about the competent and willing bureaucracy in Brazil, this is what was a major obstacle. So during this time period, you had a divided bureaucracy between, on the one hand, permanent and selectively recruited civil servants, and on the other, politically appointed civil servants that were under the control of labor leaders and the Ministry of Labor and the Brazilian Labour Party. So this divided bureaucracy meant it was very difficult to get the traction to pursue the reforms, even if they got approval in Congress, which was more likely to be the case given the growing dominance of the two allied parties, the two pro-Vargas parties, the Social Democratic Party and the Brazilian Labour Party. But I mean, it wasn't all plain sailing. Even among these parties, you had rural and conservative factions, especially within the Social Democratic Party, the PSD. So alongside the rural conservative faction of the PSD and the more right-wing parties in Congress, this technocratic division in the bureaucracy made the passing of the more radical reforms of the executive increasingly difficult. And with the economic difficulties, the recession in the early 60s, the growing inflation, this made the reaction all the more salient, the conservative reaction that was to follow, and last for 20 years until the 1980s. Okay, so this is the post-war context, very quickly summarized. And now I want to move on to what happens in the New Republic and the growing amount of data that we have to analyze the situation since 1989. So how am I doing for time? So
it's fine, Marc.
Is it okay? Cool.
Yes.
Okay. So if there's no questions about this period or the previous period, I'm going to move on to the post-1989 settlement. And so what's key about the post-1988 political environment? Well, first of all, the military dictatorship between 64 and 85 completely overhauled the post-war party system. So the parties that dominated Brazilian politics before 1964 were abolished. And the military dictatorship basically ran a two-party system for congressional elections between its own party, Arena, and the Brazilian Democratic Movement, which was the only other party that was allowed to contest elections for Congress and at the local level. So after the dictatorship, the new parties started to emerge, or just towards the end of the dictatorship, when the dictatorship started to open up a bit more, new parties started to emerge, like the Workers' Party. The Brazilian Movement Party became the PMDB, which is still in existence and has been a very important political party in the country, probably the most influential, as well as other parties on the left and the right. But to a large extent, if we look at election results and especially focus on presidential election results, Brazilian party politics was defined by the electoral strategies and the outcomes of the hegemonic party on the center left, the Workers' Party, the PT. Congress was highly fragmented among an even larger number of parties in this time than in the post-war period. So programmatic alliances and political alliances become all the more important. And so largely the post-1980 political environment is largely a story of the political metamorphosis, what we call the political metamorphosis of the PT electorate, how it radically changes from an electorate that in the 2000s is indistinguishable from the electorate of the PT in the 1980s and the early 1990s. Okay, in this presentation, because of time constraints, I haven't gone into details as to, well, what's happening with social reform during the military dictatorship, but we can go into that if you want during the discussion. So here, the New Republic, post-1988, is largely a story of the rise and fall of Petismo. Here you can see the presidential results of second-round presidential elections in Brazil, and you can see the fluctuation in the share of the vote for the PT candidate from 1989 to 2018, and as well as the other candidates from the other parties from the different elections. So PSDB, PSL in the case of Bolsonaro in 2018, PRN in the earlier period. So it's largely a story of the rise and fall of the PT for the presidential elections. But we should not lose sight of what's happening in Congress, because Congress is where legislation gets passed and where any hope of progressive redistributive reforms can get passed. And this is where the situation is interesting, because a fractured Congress, which requires more political alliances, means that you have to give into certain concessions. And you can see that even if the Workers' Party, at the height of its power with Lula's first election and re-election, getting over 60% of the vote in the second round, in Congress, the PT never managed to get 20% of congressional seats. Other parties being generally stronger for historical reasons. The PMDB, as I said, was the heir to the PDB, which was the only party that was allowed to contest elections during the military dictatorship. And you get the growing strength of the PSDB on the center right, and other parties on the left and the right. So this is only showing the five principal parties in Brazil over this time period, 1990 to 2010. But note that the number of parties went from 19 parties in 1990 to 23 parties in 2010. And I think after the last election in 2018, I think it's up to 27 political parties in Brazil that are represented in Congress. So huge amount of parties. And so to get parliamentary majorities, it requires negotiations, as I said, programmatic alliances and concessions. So it's not all that plain sailing in terms of even if you control the presidency in Brazil. Okay, so what do we know about the rise and fall of PT and its electoral base? So here we're going to look at data from Brazil's electoral polls as conducted by the Datafolha Institute. And first of all, we see an evolution in the PT electorate from being a high-income party to being a low-income party, a party of high-income voters to low-income voters. So from 1989 election to the 2018 election, we can see a radical change in the composition of its electorate. So here, taking voters and ranking them by their levels of income. And you can see that in the 89 election that there was a higher share of voters from the top 10% income group that were voting for Lula than in the poorest 50%, with the middle 40% being in between. But you can see that over time, how this tendency shifts and inverts by Lula's re-election in 2006. So this is, again, only looking at presidential elections. All these results are for presidential election. So from 2006 onwards, then you get the big inversion. And it seems that individuals from the poorest half of the Brazilian population are much more inclined to vote for the PT than people from the middle or the top of the distribution. But other things could be going on rather than income. So it's important to look to see how important income is in explaining the PT vote by controlling for other factors. Okay, so again, same time period. And what this graph is showing is the difference between the percentage of bottom 50% income earners voting for the PT and the percentage of the top 50% earners voting for PT. So the ratio between the bottom and the top. So if the ratio is negative, it means that the top is more likely to vote for the PT. If it's positive, it means that the bottom is much more likely to vote for the PT because it's the percentage of the bottom 50 of the top 50. And the line in red just shows, you know, the raw difference, not controlling for anything. So you can see that the raw difference, it's about, in 1989, the top 50% were 7 percentage points more likely to vote for the PT than someone from the bottom 50%. Whereas in 2018, someone from the bottom 50% was 20 percentage points more likely to vote for the PT than someone from the top 50%. But then once we start controlling for other factors, you see that the weight of income is not as strong. If we control for education, which is the blue line, education, age, and gender, the green line, so the relationship gets weaker. Even after we control for, you know, all socio-demographic and geographic variables, you know, we still get an important cleavage that emerges from income. That is, even after controlling for everything, in 2018 election, someone from the richest top half of the distribution was 10 percentage points more likely to vote, less likely to vote for the PT. So equivalently, someone from the bottom 50% was 10 percentage points more likely to vote for the PT than someone from the top 50%. Okay, so it reduces by half the gap once we control for other factors. But the tendency over time, you can still see it's still there. They go from generally a higher income party to being a party of more lower income voters. What about education? Education, you get a similar picture. The PT was the party in the 1980s and early 1990s of the higher educated individuals. You can see here the composition of education attainment from primary education, secondary and tertiary. People with each of these attained each of these different levels of education and the vote for the PT. And you can see that in 1989, university graduates were much more likely to vote for the PT than secondary or primary graduates. But this gets inverted by the 2000s. And again, since the 2006 election, after Lula's first term. So a complete inversion from a party of the higher educated to a party of the lower educated. And again, if we try to estimate how important education is in explaining the PT vote, it's strong. And after controlling for everything, it's probably a bit stronger than we saw for income. So that is here the gray line. After controlling for everything, we see that say in 2018, the difference between the percentage of primary educated voters voting PT and all other voters is almost 15 percentage points. So if you only have primary education, on average, you're 15 percentage points more likely to vote for PT than if you have secondary or tertiary education. Whereas this was the complete opposite in the 1980s and early 1990s. Okay. What about region? Well, region is interesting because region ends up being actually the strongest predictor of voting for the PT in recent years. But again, it's gone through a radical change since the first presidential election after the new constitution, whereby in the earlier period, the PT was attracting a larger share of its votes from the south and the southeast of the country, which is the richest part of the country, as we know. But then again, from after the PT's first presidential term, this completely gets inverted. It actually gets inverted in Lula's first election in 2002. But then the strong tendency starts to emerge from 2006 onwards, where it's attracting more and more of its voters from the northeast rather than the richer south and southeast of the country. And again, if we try to estimate how important region is in explaining the PT vote, in terms of ranking all the socio-demographic and geographic variables, it's the most important predictor in terms of the difference between the percentage of Northeast voting PT and the percentage of other regions voting PT, even after controlling for everything, income, education, age, gender, were over 20 percentage points in recent years. And it's been like all, income and education, you get this shift from negative difference, to the positive difference over time. So being in the Northeast seems to be a very important predictor of voting PT. And of course, being in the Northeast, because it's the poorest, among the poorest part of the country, and it's voters from the Northeast are generally not only poor on income, but poor in other socio-demographic dimensions as well. And so PT over time loses the urban bias. This is just following on from the previous slides. Because it was heavily, more heavily voted by citizens in the South and the Southeast, which is more urbanized than the rest of the country, it had large urban bias. So the difference of rural areas voting PT and urban areas voting PT was negative. So it means that there was a lot more urban voters voting PT than rural voters, controlling for everything. But over time, this has become weak because of the shift to the Northeast and the shift away from the South and the more urbanized South and Southeast. What about race? So in the political attitude surveys that we use, unfortunately, there's no long-run time series on voters being asked according to their skin color, blacks, pardos, morenos, or whites, who they vote for. But in the 2018 election, it was asked, and it's just interesting to note that the difference between the percentage of non-whites in Brazil and whites voting PT was about 17 percentage points in 2018. Controlling for everything else, you get down to about 10 percentage points. So on average, if you're black, pardo, moreno, you're 10 percentage points more likely to vote for PT than if you're white. Which is interesting because if you compare with other countries, and this is why I put in the title of the slide a weak racial cleavage, comparing to countries like France, and you do the same with religion, Muslims, the Muslim vote for the left first, and the non-Muslim vote for the left, or in the case of the US, the black vote for the Democratic Party. These differences are much larger in these countries compared to Brazil. So, and from an international perspective, Brazil has quite a weak racial cleavage that on the basis of what you see in for instance, in the United States, you'd expect that the non-whites there'd be a higher difference in voting for the PT between non-whites and whites, just on the basis of what you see in countries like the United States, not to mention South Africa. So there's quite a weak racial cleavage, which is probably explained by the importance of the other factors, material factors and geographic factors in explaining the PT vote. But this is something we can come back to. In terms of understanding the fall of the PT in more recent elections, we can point to numerous factors and see, well, how important they are. Religion has often been talked about as a factor that was quite determinant in the 2018 election. And you can see that indeed, if you just to plot the difference between Protestants voting PT and other voters, other religious or non-religious voters voting PT, you get a large negative bias that Protestant voters seem to have shifted away from the PT. And of course, the composition of Protestant voters has changed over time in Brazil, with the rise of evangelicals being quite important in more recent elections, and the recent 2018 election. But is religion a factor? I think it's definitely a factor in the more recent election, in the 2018 election, but I don't think it's completely determinant to explain the shift, the time trend. Well, what about corruption? Now, corruption has also been talked about a lot in Brazil as being to the downfall of the PT, given the scandals that have emerged during its time in power. But if it's interesting, if you stratify, I mean, overall, corruption is not the most important issue for Brazilian voters, if you take it in general. Material issues such as employment and health tend to rank as more important. And if you decompose the population by income group, you can see how the different issues weigh up for different parts of the distribution. So the top is more biased towards being preoccupied about corruption and security, whereas the bottom tends to prioritize more health and employment issues, so more material conditions, even though we know that the poorest parts of the country and poorest strata of society are much more affected by security issues. Homicides are much more prevalent among the poorest neighborhoods. But even still, it may suggest that material conditions are a symptom of poverty, and the violence is a symptom of poverty, which is a symptom of poor material conditions. But crucially, and this linking back to the point about inequality, is the evolution of income inequality and the distribution of economic growth during the period of the Pétain reign in the presidency, where combining different data, tax records and household surveys to get a more accurate picture of what is going on, we can see that the distribution of growth followed quite an asymmetric pattern, where you've got higher than average growth for the poorest strata of the population, booming incomes at the top, above the top 1%, and a squeezed, what we can call a squeezed middle class, which eventually were a lot of the voters that had once voted for the Pétain in Lula's first election, say in 2002, but over time quickly turned against the Pétain. And so an important cohort alongside business elites, which were never enamored with the Workers' Party. But also there has to be a shift within the growth, within the poorest parts of the population, because here, if you were to just assume that, okay, the growth of the poor, the share of the population where its growth of income was above average is about slightly over 50% of the population. So if they all voted Pétain would never have lost an election after 2014. So obviously there's certain parts of poor households that are not voting Pétain, either because they don't vote at all, which is, which we know that poorer households have a lower participation than richer households. So that's an important factor. But also poor voters that have voted for other parties, which is also because of different types of concerns. It can be corruption and security concerns, but especially the narrative around how the Pétain handled the impending recession, or the responsibility that was put on the Pétain for the recession that was to come in 2014 and 15, as well as the calls by other parties to lower taxes, and which were important sound bites for people on lower incomes. So just to wrap up what I've presented, if we look at the more recent period and even look at Brazil today, economic class divisions tied to geography, so tied to region specifically, appear to be the strongest cleavage in Brazilian society today. And it's interesting because political conflict in Brazil, at least since democratization, has increasingly followed a unidimensional economic class path, as opposed to other countries and other advanced democracies where it's becoming increasingly bidimensional, meaning that you've got a split in the electorate between high education voters voting for the left and high income voters voting for the right. In Brazil, the income and educational split seems to be more united, that lower income, low education voters still seem to have a persistent tendency towards voting more for the center left. So it's an interesting international comparison. Of a center left party, the PT, which transformed itself really radically from being a party of the young, highly educated, high income elite of the southern part of the country to being a party more of the poorer and lesser educated voters, increasingly located in the Northeast, which is the most disadvantaged region of the country. So we argue in our work that contextual policy-driven factors and programmatic alliances are key to understand the transformation of electoral cleavages and the evolution of the hegemonic party of the left in Brazil, which has dominated the presidency for the last, for most of the 21st century so far. But taking a longer run perspective, the history of democratization in Brazil has been a history of insiders versus outsiders, just because of the rules of the game, stating who is eligible to vote and who is not. Insiders and outsiders in terms of the division of congressional seats and the presidential elections. So the division between congressional elections and presidential elections, between urban, and rural factions, urban-weighted, rural-weighted elections, regional disparities, all these were tied to, and the distribution of growth, which was as important in the post-war period as it has been in the 21st century, to explain these dynamics. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.